At 57, Mark Ellery learned how quickly stability can vanish without warning. The eviction notice lay flat on his kitchen table like a quiet accusation, its bold print impossible to ignore. 30 days. That was all the time he had left before the last thin layer of security gave way. For 25 years, he had worked the same factory floor, believing loyalty and effort created safety. Then the doors shut, machines went silent, and the world moved on without him. 8 months later, his daughter delayed college to work double shifts, and his son struggled with medical debt after the birth of his first child. Mark carried the weight of their sacrifices like a private punishment. When a lawyer offered him a cash job to clean out a long-abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town, he didn't hesitate. The pay was small, but it meant groceries, lights, and a little time. On the drive there, he rehearsed resignation more than hope. Another forgotten property, another temporary fix. The mansion loomed behind rusted iron gates and overgrown hedges, its faded grandeur hollowed by time. As Mark stepped onto the sagging porch with broom and gloves in hand, he believed he was walking into dust and decay. He had no idea he was about to walk into a secret buried so deep that entire generations had been shaped around its silence. Inside, the mansion felt suspended between memory and abandonment. Dust layered every surface so thick it dulled the sound of his footsteps. Sunlight cut through broken glass in pale shafts, illuminating torn velvet drapes and furniture draped in white sheets like resting phantoms. Mark worked methodically, clearing one room at a time, hauling out brittle chairs, stacking chipped dishes, uncovering fragments of lives that had simply stopped. He found photographs in tarnished frames. A stern man in military uniform, a woman in pearls, a little girl smiling stiffly beside a garden hedge. By the fourth day, he climbed into the servants' quarters beneath the sloping roof, where the walls peeled and the air grew heavy. As he stripped away warped wallpaper in one room, his hand paused on a seam that didn't align. He tugged gently, and more paper loosened. Beneath it, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a hidden door. His heart began to pound, not from fear but from the strange electricity of discovery. He pried it open to reveal a narrow staircase leading upward into darkness. The attic was crowded with crates, trunks, and shrouded furniture. At the far wall, beneath boards that looked newer than the rest, his flashlight caught something different. A false wall. Someone had hidden something here deliberately and never returned for it. Behind the concealed boards rested a single leather trunk, its brass fitting stained green with age, an ornate letter barely visible on its lid. It was heavier than it looked, heavy with intention. Mark hesitated only a moment before forcing the old lock. Inside lay journals, bundled letters, legal documents, and photographs preserved with unnatural care. The top journal belonged to Captain James Thornhill, dated during the war. As Mark read by flashlight, he followed the voice of a man writing not of glory but of exhaustion, loyalty, and longing for home. Midway through the entries, the tone shifted. Business concerns appeared. Doubt. A trusted partner named Richard Holbrook making decisions without consultation. Then Mark found the letter written years later in trembling ink, a confession by a dying man admitting to forged documents, stolen assets, and betrayal. James Thornhill's death had been ruled natural, yet the words in Mark's hands told of theft and calculated destruction. His breath caught as the truth assembled piece by piece. The mansion upstairs felt suddenly alive with unanswered questions. That night, under the dim kitchen light of his apartment, Mark spread the contents of the trunk across his table. He realized he was no longer holding forgotten papers. He was holding the remains of a crime time had failed to erase. Mark couldn't let the discovery rest. Night after night, he returned to the public library, tracing names through old records, property deeds, and faded articles. He followed the Thornhill family forward through history and the Holbrook fortune as it flourished in their absence. The injustice grew clearer with every document. With the help of a quiet librarian who believed in lost stories, he located living descendants, Margaret Ashford in Portland and her nephew Gregory in California. When Margaret saw the evidence for the first time, she wept not only for what had been stolen, but for the years her grandmother had been dismissed. Then the warnings came. Typed notes slipped under Mark's door. Photos taken from across the street, a demand to return the trunk and forget the past. The message was unmistakable. Someone powerful still guarded this secret. Fear settled into Mark's chest, but something else rose beside it. Resolve. He had already lost nearly everything. Work, comfort, certainty. Fear had little left to threaten. When Margaret arrived to see the documents in person, they uncovered another hidden compartment beneath the trunk's lining. Inside lay a slim diary belonging to James Thornhill's teenage daughter. The final entries described overheard arguments the night her father died. The truth crossed from fraud into murder. The confrontation came without warning. Gordon Holbrook crashed into Mark's apartment with two men in dark jackets moving like hired shadows. His voice was sharp with entitlement as he demanded the trunk, the papers, the silence he believed he still owned. He dismissed the evidence as lies, waved legal threats like weapons, and spoke as if money itself would bend reality back into place. But Margaret stood between him and the truth with trembling hands and unbreakable resolve. Decades of buried grief rose in her posture as she held her mother's diary like a shield. When Gordon realized the heirs were united, the evidence copied, and the authorities already alerted, his confidence fractured. The apartment filled with tension thick as smoke. Police arrived, statements were taken. Lawyers circled like opposing storms. By morning, the story burst beyond the walls that had held it for generations. On the courthouse steps, under flashing cameras and murmuring crowds, Margaret showed her grandfather's photograph and spoke of theft masked as legacy. Gregory followed with documents and proof. Mark stood behind them, a man the world had ignored until now, feeling the weight of what he had helped awaken. The past was no longer trapped in dust. It was standing in daylight, and it would not be pushed back into silence again. The town did not react with one voice. Whispers raced through cafes and sidewalks, splitting neighbors into believers and doubters. Some felt betrayed by a history they had trusted without question. Others felt relief as truth finally pierced the old fog of myth. Lawsuits moved swiftly. Trust accounts froze. Property claims resurfaced. The abandoned mansion on Maple Street became more than a structure. It became a symbol of long-delayed reckoning. Mark did not gain sudden wealth from the storm he had stirred. What he gained instead was something steadier. Community members organized support to delay his eviction. A local contractor offered him regular work maintaining historic buildings. Old friends reappeared with quiet respect in their eyes. His daughter returned to her studies without the weight of sacrifice chained to her future. His son finally breathed easier knowing his father had chosen integrity over fear. Justice did not arrive like thunder. It advanced inch by inch, contract by contract, ruling by ruling. Yet with every small shift, Mark felt something align inside him that had been broken since the factory closed. He was no longer just surviving, he was standing. Months later, Margaret returned to the mansion alone before restoration began. The dust was gone. The air was clearer. Sunlight stretched across bare wooden floors where decay had once ruled. She stood in the old study where her grandfather had worked, reading the space like a memory written into walls. "They tried to erase us," she whispered, "but memory outlived them." Mark watched from the doorway, understanding in that moment that history does not disappear, it only waits. The Holbrook name still appeared on buildings and plaques, but its shine had changed. It now reflected truth as well as power. The Thornhill name, once reduced to footnotes and rumors, now lived again in records, testimony, and living descendants. Mark still woke before sunrise for work. His hands were still scarred from years of labor. His bank account still required caution. But when he looked in the mirror now, he no longer saw a discarded man. He saw someone who had chosen to act when silence would have been easier, and that choice had reshaped everything. Years later, the mansion reopened as a restored landmark, its gates no longer rusted shut by forgotten sin. Lights sparkled through restored glass, and voices filled rooms that had once echoed with decay. A modest plaque near the entrance told the real story, not of wealth, but of betrayal, courage, and a truth that refused to die quietly. Mark stood beneath it with his children at his sides, feeling the strange peace of standing inside something that had once terrified